Hola, maricones, papachos, dames, caballeres y todo lo que se encuentra ahí en medio. Estamos en Aire Libre y en esta ocasión estamos acompañados por Andrew Butler de Hércules and Love Affair, donde vamos a tener una pequeña conversación alrededor de sus nuevos lanzamientos y de la música que ha producido hasta ahora. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So this is not your first time in Mexico City. You've been here quite a while. So can you tell me about, just as a head start, how's your experience in Mexico City so far?
This trip is like most others, which means thoroughly enjoyable. I mean, like, I love coming here. I really love coming to Mexico in general, but I love coming to Mexico City especially.
Is it different now visiting after the pandemic and sort of the madness that we've experienced over the past years?
It's hard for me to say in terms of, like, well, my personal experience. I mean, in terms of the city of Mexico City, say, per se,
Yeah.
like, in terms of being back in clubs and playing music, it was incredibly different feeling, and it was surreal at first to be in a room full of people that were able to even touch each other, that were able to, like, bump into each other and hug each other and dance and sweat, breathe on each other. So the first couple DJ sets after the pandemic definitely, for me as a DJ, felt there was a little bit of a hurdle. Like, I had to get used to it. You know what I mean? But I think the big hurdle happened in New York City. I played at a club called Good Room. It's a very, like, legendary sort of.
Heard of it.
Yeah. And the venue was packed. I think it was sold out times 3. So I was, within the first 10 minutes of DJing, drenched in sweat. And this is maybe my 5th or 6th gig after starting again after the pandemic. And there was no ventilation. And I thought to myself, after I had to take my shirt off, we were talking earlier, naturally I had to take my shirt off, and because it literally was like I had jumped into a pool. It was that hot.
Walls, sweat,
everything. And so after that gig, I walked back to the hotel, and I thought to myself, well, if I caught COVID, I caught COVID tonight.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch COVID.
You didn't know.
No.
You know, that's unpredictable. That's life nowadays.
That is life nowadays.
Anything can happen right now.
That's true.
So that's sort of interesting, because I think that the role of music has changed, especially within this context of pandemic. Let's not say World War III. So what do you think the role of music is nowadays, thinking of this heavy context that we're facing, especially dance music?
I'm eternally grateful for dance music culture. Like, I mean, it was the place that I first found, I think, a forum where I could truly express myself and be, like, at home, you know, because I didn't feel at home anywhere until I really found myself, I guess, in a nightclub. And like 30 years later of living a life of really nightlife and dance music, you know, I'm still really grateful for that, you know. And I think the experience at those first parties after the pandemic, I mean, if we could say after the pandemic, because we don't know really what's there was an incredible fever in the air. There was incredible joy. It was beautiful to be all be back together again. For me, I will say that over the past few years, and this is pre-pandemic, life and the world became seemingly increasingly more chaotic, more disrupted. There was much more unrest. There was much more visible injustice. You know, Corona happened, COVID happened right after years of a really outrageous presidency in the United States, which was quite unbearable. There was a lot of unrest around all the police brutality. The world is not and as you said, now we're looking at conflicts, and it's not just in the Ukraine. That is the focus of most people's attention right now, but you have things like in Venezuela taking place, which is totally underrepresented, or you have things taking place in Yemen, and we see these things in a way that we've never seen them before, or we have access to information in a way, and social media has
you can just see it.
It's exponential,
yeah.
Right? And that level of overstimulation, and also on some level, powerlessness, the feeling of powerlessness in the face of a lot of those things, there were moments where people were activated and they mobilized, and we saw people pushing for change. But for me, just using that Friday and Saturday night to release my tension, it just didn't cut it. It wasn't cutting it anymore. And I felt, especially in terms of my own artistic output and the music that I make, I needed to make something that was talking about my everyday experience and talking, I think in some ways, about our collective everyday experience, which is a lot more fraught with difficult emotion and a lot of burden. So it's wonderful to go release and have joy in the nightclub, and nightlife, but it's not enough to just have those moments happen every now and then. And so the record I made this time, which is being released soon, I just released the first single, there's a different motivation behind why I made the record. It's a more dealing with everyday life kind of thing, rather than let's look forward to the weekend kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. From the first single that we just heard, we can tell that it's going to be perhaps a more contemplative album, as you said, an album that is dwelling on some more heavy emotional aspects of life. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're trying to convey with this album?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think the maybe biggest talking point about the new album, and the very exciting news, is that Anoni has returned. It's a momentous occasion, and for me, it marks something very special in my artistic journey to have someone who basically I do consider to be probably the greatest artistic inspiration I've ever personally known, but that I also have just admired. I admired from afar, and that I really, really believe in. Obviously, having Anoni in the mix, you can only expect that there's going to be some gravitas. There's going to be some heavy-duty stuff taking place. We're not playing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Anoni is not an artist that plays, which can be difficult at times. But what was interesting about making this album was, over the course of 5 years that it's taken to realize, we both were going through our own processes, experiencing this level of chaos, like the extreme frustration watching some totalitarian sort of leader take over our country, the extreme anger, righteous anger that you could see brown and black people in the United States dealing with, the struggle to understand how to appropriately utilize your voice with social media and everything. Like, we both went through our own experiences of that, And for me, one thing that has been really important to me, which I explored a lot on my album before this, Omnion, was that I needed to identify the best means possible to find a place of peace, serenity, and effectiveness, like from a personal standpoint.
That's interesting. Why effectiveness?
Well, because if I am a human being that's completely fixated on distraction, trying to solve internal problems with external solutions, very frequently in my life, that from starting at an early age, that was through the use of drugs and alcohol or whatever other means to sort of cope or deal with my suffering or my problems. Being that kind of a human being that's always chasing and always dissatisfied and always lacking was something I had to deal with. And it's something that I think I'm not the only one that has to deal with that. I think in some ways was part of the reason why I made the music I made and I brought to the table for this record, was because I wanted to share that process. I've put a lot of effort into finding serenity and thereby becoming a more effective, loving, available useful person in this world. Anoni, her experience, which you will also hear on the record, is a particularly different one. And on her previous record, 2015's record, Hopelessness, she put forward a lot of pretty heavy critique around various political situations. She did not hold back, let's say.
Not at all.
Not at all. And on this record, she holds back a lot less. Okay. So there were expressions of that level of frustration and that level of incisive clarity and an ability to articulate and break down what's actually going on in these systems that seem, for most of us walking around on this planet, impenetrable. We can't comprehend, like, these monster corporations, and like Anoni has this unbelievable ability to Absolutely. Break things down, articulate what's going on, and out of her anger often comes this very incisive, like, cutting clarity. So that is very much kind of the content and lyrical content that she brought to the record. So I brought something more, I guess, about finding a quiet way to walk through this really crazy world, and she brought anger, but necessary anger to the record. So it's a pretty different Hercules and Love Affair record.
I'm very curious to hear about it. And there is something very interesting that you bring to the table. I was just speaking to a friend the other day, talking about how thirsty we are for the truth. I don't mean the truth like in institutional way, but just hearing someone's truth.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that I sense that you're approaching with this record, and I think that's fantastic to have out there. Someone telling their truth, delivering it with honesty and vulnerability. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for saying something like that.
Cheers. So I also wanted to ask you, I'm the co-host of a specialized section on LGBTQ representation. So I wanted to ask you, how do you perceive LGBTQ representation and queerness has evolved over your professional years and your trajectory, and where do you feel it's going right now?
That's a beautiful question. I have a lot of faith and hope for young people today. At this point, I'm in my early, but getting to mid 40s, and I really recognize that there is an amazing young movement around identifying, claiming a language, identifying very clearly their boundaries, not being ashamed to assert those boundaries, courageously calling things out when they need to, and walking with less shame than even I did. And I was a pretty out there kid. I was like, at 15 years old, I was out. I was out in a pretty conservative environment, at an all-boys school. And I was, taking the bus downtown to go to rallies, and whatever sort of remnants of the ACT UP movement that took place in the 80s around the AIDS crisis. I was very fiercely identifying with that, though not fully consciously understanding, I think, what me being very loud about my queerness meant. And in some ways it was a bit misguided, I think. I think just it's incredible that there are there's conversations around concepts like consent that never happened 15 to 20 years ago when I was a young queer person. I mean, that would have probably protected me, in some ways. There's an unbelievable panorama of articulated identities that young people are now able to express themselves with. Like, I had the absolute honor to involve a tremendously beautiful non-binary model in the video for Grace, who I got to spend some time with, and they were so amazingly open in terms of sharing with me their experience of their, gender identity, their sexuality, but then to also patiently, as I clumsily try to understand exactly what life was like for them, they could talk in this way that we just didn't have that language when I was growing up,
Exactly.
We didn't have those choices. It didn't seem like we had those choices. I just think it's awesome. I mean, I will say also, I'm very proud of Hercules and Love Affair in general, on the whole, because I had people show up as they were from the beginning with just such courage, whether it was Kim Ann Foxman, whether it was Sean J. Wright. I was so honored and lucky to work with people who they weren't hiding their faces, and it's been like that from the beginning, and it's still like that today. I think we showed at the beginning of this whole thing and throughout that guess what, you're on the list, welcome to the party. There's no discrimination here, like there's no room for this here, so I've been very blessed to be a part of something like that, and it happened at a moment where these conversations around trans issues and they really started to bloom and blossom. I was maybe a facilitator. I was definitely more in the background, but a lot of credit has to go to Anoni for confronting these issues so early on in her work, whether it was Vanting and the Johnsons, whether it was championing Marsha P. Johnson way before it was like a thing, really. We played our part. We played our part in this evolution. But I noticed that and I recognize that there's new kids. There's new kids, and I have stuff to learn from the new kids.
Absolutely, we all do.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you as a gay man from Mexico City who grew up listening to your music and seeing some representation out there when we didn't really get any here in Mexico. So listening to your music and seeing your videos and your blatant queerness with a punk attitude, I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for the time that you spent with us. I believe we're out of time now, but this has been fantastic.
Hey there, this is Andy Butler from Hercules and Love Affair, and you're listening and watching Aire Libre.